From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Luke Jones.
And I'm Manveen Rana. And they've led us into a studio again together.
Back together at last. It is the last Thursday of the month, so we're going to do another Q&A like we did
It's a reunion tour.
Well, actually, it's been quite a good time for it as well, hasn't it? Because there's been lots going on, lots of chaotic matters around the world, but also at home.
The news certainly hasn't calmed down. I'd love it to just stop for a moment.
Yes.
Give us a holiday, but no, there's plenty to talk about.
We have had, in the past month or so, just to refresh you, we've had more threats against Iran. We have had Keir Starmer's premiership get to the precipice, look over the edge, as I think Ed Miliband said, and then teeter back over it. And then, of course, the whole to do with Peter Mandelson and the former Prince Andrew.
The release of the Epstein files and a chaotic time stateside. We've just had a State of the Union address.
Yes. Almost 2 hours.
Almost 2 hours.
Which I think is what we're going for.
Don't worry, I promise it won't last that long. Switch us off if it does.
But do get in touch anytime if you've got any questions. The story at thetimes.com is how to get in touch with questions or even with just your own view of things that we're talking about. Today, though, we're going to look at your questions relating to Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor and Peter Mandelson. The story today, your questions answered. Let's get into Andrew.
One of the biggest responses we've had has been on Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor. We've had emails from people saying, the age of hiding behind wealth must end. Chilling and unfortunately, so unsurprising.
And this actually is quite a rare space in the Times stable for discussion about this, because we should explain there's been a bit of upset in various inboxes about why the comments have been turned off on the Times online articles relating to Prince Andrew. I know you're in charge of all matters digital. Why is that?
He says that because I don't know how to use my email. We should explain this isn't in any way censorship or deference to the royal family. It's only because in both the cases of Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor and Peter Mandelson, there are now live investigations. Arrests have been made, which does restrict how much we can say, and this will be a bit of a legal minefield, but also it makes it very hard to have comments open because the public won't be aware of the legal boundaries. So that's why we haven't been able to have open comments under any of those articles. But we did want to give you space to reflect your opinions and to ask questions, which is why we've been seeking your questions for this session, and we'll try and get through as many as we can.
Starting with this one from Bidita, who is in London. They say, what contribution, if any, is a trade envoy like Andrew giving to our economy? Because, of course, Prince Andrew for many few years was a trade envoy travelling the world, beating the drum for UK trade and investment. What do you think?
Well, we should say it was a controversial appointment. We are told that the king, who was Prince Charles at the time, wasn't keen that he should get the position, but actually Peter Mandelson, who was the Minister for Trade at the time, the Secretary of State for Trade, did encourage the Prime Minister to give Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor the role. It's really hard for us to know whether it was value for money because so many of the details are still not released. So under the 20-year rule, we should have been able to see some of the documents around his time as a trade envoy, but they've been withheld because they're sort of deemed to be sensitive for foreign relations. But there has been a parliamentary debate, and we are told that some of those will be released soon. So we might get a little bit more sense of how much the whole thing cost and what sort of a role he was playing. And then we'll get a more detailed assessment.
And this is yet another extraordinary tranche of documents that will come. Now, it seems like the bulk of it might come once any kind of legal process relating to Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor has been concluded, because the government, in the shape of Chris Bryant the other day in the Commons, did say that they agreed with this Lib Dem motion put forward to release all these files, but said they didn't want to do anything that would prejudice the police investigation. But again, it's going to be quite an amazing, frank insight into the inner workings of government in a way that we haven't seen before. Because you mentioned the 20-year rule there.
Yeah.
Of course, every year we have those days where journalists all troop off to the National Archives and get to see, what Tony Blair, I think, is sort of where we're up to at the moment, what they were saying about colleagues and the rest. But it never relates to the royal family because of the rules around it. So this will probably be our first insight into what they were thinking about members of the royal family, what members of the royal family were saying to ministers, what they thought about this appointment or other things.
And that's because this was quite an unusual role. It was unusual to have a member of the royal family doing a role like a trade envoy, which does mean that the records will be there, you're right, in the 20 years later. And just on the subject of that parliamentary debate, which is why we're hoping these papers will be released, that alone was quite a moment this week. On Tuesday, the subject of Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor was suddenly in the spotlight, in the chamber. And this was a very rare moment. Luke, tell us a bit about that.
Yeah. So the Lib Dems, fritters they, moved a humble address. Again, one of these devices to try and get documents out of the government's archives relating to Prince Andrew's appointment as this trade envoy. But it was only allowed to happen because the current Speaker, Lindsay Hoyle, decided that and ruled that, well, Andrew isn't a royal anymore, so you can discuss and debate him. Because if you flick back to the old rule book, late 19th century rule book of the House of Commons, Erskine May, it says that you can't discuss and debate the monarch, the heir to the throne, or the royal family. And in fact, Chris Bryant, who was there speaking for the government, he's currently a trade minister, was saying back in 2011, when he was asking questions about Prince Andrew, he was told by the then Speaker, John Bercow, whatever happened to him, quote, references to members of the royal family should be very rare, very sparing, and very respectful. And in fact, it was our own Steve Swinford, political editor of the Times, who actually did a search through Hansard, the official transcript of debates in the House of Commons, and found that Prince Andrew had been mentioned a handful of times. I think it was 6 in all these years. And Chris Bryant's point back in 2011, when he was banging the drum about this, was very prescient, was, you know, if everyone in the country is speaking about it, and the House of Commons is meant to be one of these protected spaces, and yet
you have parliamentary privilege, which is this weird little quirk of the law, which means you can say almost anything about almost anyone, but not the royal family.
Even if everyone outside of the House of Commons, who don't necessarily have legal privilege, are all chatting about the royal family. So it was amazing to see with that valve opened somewhat, just how frank some of them were. Chris Bryant, again, in his speech to the House,
having a field day, being able to say the things he couldn't in 2011.
He said he has spoken to many colleagues and civil servants and, quote, they told me their own stories of their interactions with Mr. Mountbatten-Windsor. He said, they all betray the same pattern.
A man on a constant self-aggrandising and self-enriching hustle. A rude, arrogant and entitled man who could not distinguish between the public interest, which he said he served, and his own private interest.
Damning.
Sir Ed Davey, who is the Lib Dem leader, of course, he was in that debate. He said that Prince Andrew, quote, shamed our country.
Can there be many people more symbolic of the rot that eats away at the British establishment than the former Duke of York and Special Trade Envoy?
And we haven't heard from Prince Andrew about any of these things that are currently the matter of debate and matter of police investigation. He has previously, though, denied any wrongdoing. David from Berkhamsted in Hertfordshire has been in touch with Manveen. He says, what is the current process for authorising the costs incurred for and the charges arising from trips by so-called trade envoys? Who holds the budget for these expenses and who is responsible for scrutinising them?
It's a great question, and it's something that actually we don't look at enough. And in a way, this story has sort of shone a light on a part of the process that doesn't get enough scrutiny. With Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor, we know that he didn't have a salary for the post, but he did get expenses. A lot of these trade delegations generally do. And if you sort of watch, those big foreign trips where they take a trade delegation, quite often they will be very powerful, big sort of business names. And so you always imagine the expenses are probably a little bit higher than ordinary civil servants. But we know that the idea, there is kind of like an ethos around this. They are sort of encouraged to remember that this is part of a public service, effectively. This is a government trip, and not to spend too much. I think final scrutiny comes down to the Secretary of State for Business Trade, who actually sort of signs off on the budgets. And the Times did reveal on Monday that 2 former civil servants claimed that Andrew had been charging taxpayers for massages while on these trips. One of them said he was shocked by Andrew's spending, with excessive flights and unreasonable numbers of hotel rooms for his entourage. So he's not travelling alone on these trips.
No.
In a way, we were getting reports in the press, even if it wasn't talked about in Parliament. And this is when he did himself the nickname in headlines of Air Miles Andy.
As you've mentioned, Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor was arrested by police on suspicion of misconduct in public office. Peter Mandelson was arrested and released on bail early this week on suspicion of misconduct in public office. It's understood that he strenuously denies those charges against him and will be vigorously defending himself. We've had a question from George in London. Why was Andrew released, quote, under investigation, whereas Peter Mandelson was bailed? What are the implications of the two different approaches? Because it has been similar but slightly different, actually, in terms of what's happened with Mountbatten-Windsor and Mandelson.
Yeah, and we should say part of that will be because these are two different police forces going through two different processes of gathering evidence and being at different stages in their investigation. So it's Thames Valley Police for Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor and the Metropolitan Police for Peter Mandelson. Basically, when you are arrested, there are various different outcomes that might happen. If they think they need to question you more, there is more of an inquiry happening. You will either be released under investigation, which is what has happened to Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor. That means the investigation is ongoing. They may need to question him again. We'll have to wait and see. Or you're released on bail, which is what's happened with Peter Mandelson. That's slightly harder because, in a way, if you're the police, there's sort of a ticking clock on this. You have less time because we know that, bail is up in 3 months or 6 months and then it has to be renewed. So you're putting a bit of a stopwatch on your investigation. You're giving yourself limits that you probably didn't want. But we think the reason they opted for that option was because we're now told there was a tip-off from the Commons Speaker, Sir Lindsay Hoyle, to the Metropolitan Police, saying he understood that Peter Mandelson might be ready to leave the country and apparently go to the British Virgin Islands.
Well, hang on, let's pull a few of these threads out. So this was like an enormous row that happened earlier in the week where there was a sort of briefing war. We had ended up having a statement from Mandelson's lawyers, Michon de Raya, denying that he was ever going to up sticks and flee. One strange thing. Second strange thing is, why the British Virgin Islands?
I know. Where you'd have an extradition treaty.
It's a British overseas territory.
Yes.
So the whole thing is, I don't understand what is happening and
it does seem
why
like
various corners are briefing what they are.
Yeah, it has been a very strange affair, but it does explain why this arrest happened and why he was released in the middle of the night at about 2 a.m. under bail.
In terms of how Sir Lindsay Hoyle, the Commons Speaker, got his hands on this, Patrick Maguire, chief political commentator, reported that Lindsay Hoyle visited the British Virgin Islands during recess last week, and he was informed by a local source that Peter Mandelson was planning to go to the islands, something that, as we mentioned, Mandelson said is a complete fiction, and that Lindsay Hoyle passed the information on to the Met Police at Scotland Yard on Monday during a meeting because he felt duty-bound to do so. So hence that sort of late afternoon arrest of Peter Mandelson and then him not returning home from questioning until the early hours of the next morning in a taxi. So strange and dramatic scenes, but as we said earlier on, in terms of the actual police investigations that are going to continue, it's understood that Peter Mandelson denies any wrongdoing. His lawyers have denied that he was going to flee the country, and former Prince Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor, he's previously strenuously denied any wrongdoing.
And neither of them have been charged. One of the questions from Vikram in Boston is, why is there such little public discourse on Queen Elizabeth II's relationship with Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor?
Alice Thompson wrote a really interesting column in The Times yesterday about this, because there has been a bit of discourse of late where, all the complaints that people have about former Prince Andrew, just relating to him, people suggesting that he's difficult to work with and was, rude and all the rest of it. Lots of people saying, well, bad mother. That's what the result was. And Alice Thompson was saying, well, too much is being put at the feet of the late Queen.
At the same time, Roya Nika, who is our expert on all things royal, has been speaking to lots of members of the royal household, as she often does. And she had an extraordinary piece in the Sunday Times saying those close to the royal family have described the dutiful Elizabeth's dereliction of duty in curbing Andrew as leaving an unexploded bomb for Charles to defuse. And there is this sense that in royal circles, people, believe that there was always this sense that he was supposed to be the favourite child. He was obviously sort of quite spoilt. There was all those stories, these great stories of him, even as an adult, having 50 teddy bears on his bed and, never sort of necessarily having to face the same consequences, I suppose, as most adults would. And, she does say no one in royal circles believes the late Queen knew anything even close to the full extent of what is now alleged. But equally, no one disputes that she turned a blind eye.
Gordon from Alberta, Canada has been in touch. Hello, Gordon. And they say, what is the palace doing to prevent any future royal blunders?
It's a difficult line to tread. You can tell they're in absolute crisis management mode at the moment.
And unlike anything that we have seen in modern times,
yeah.
Would you agree with me that this is the biggest crisis since the abdication?
Oh, I think it is. I think some people have been comparing it to, the annus horribilis and that period when there were divorces and Charles and Diana, but none of that... Fire at Windsor, but none of that actually threatened the legitimacy of the monarchy. And I think that's where this is headed. And you can tell they appreciate the size of the crisis because there are some, pretty unprecedented statements coming out of the palace with the king, quite clearly distancing himself from Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor and making it quite clear that they will help in any way possible with any investigation, which, as you say, in what used to be the code of never complain, never explain, that's all gone. For them to be quite so sort of forthright and quite so open about this and to distance themselves from Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor, is definitely a departure.
This, like the abdication, because we've got to a point where someone has been stripped of titles, stripped of being able to call himself a prince, and maybe, as we've seen in this past week, there have been more suggestions that legislation might be put forward in the UK and in some of the other territories that the king is head of state to actually remove Andrew from the line of succession. Like the abdication, that opens up the possibility that things can be tinkered with. We don't like that person, well, we can remove them from the line of succession. Whereas actually, your sort of medieval understanding of the monarchy is, well, they are there for divine right and there's no chopping and choosing. Yeah. Now you've got another instance potentially of that.
It's exactly what we were talking about earlier of what you don't want if you're in the palace is, bad headlines and tabloids doing lots of coverage that you don't like is bad enough. You don't want the royal family being discussed in Parliament. And that's exactly what we've had this week, because that's where the ability to tinker and change their rights and their ability to function and how they function is opened up. And that's exactly what this has now led to.
Yeah. It's incredible we've got this far on a podcast and not mentioned Donald Trump. Thankfully,
I knew that would change.
James from Hastings asks, although this is hugely important to UK matters, could Andrew's arrest affect how the Epstein files controversy plays out in the United States? Of course, this is a big issue for Donald Trump. There hasn't been the legal hoo-ha on that side of the Atlantic as there has here on the release of the Epstein files. Do you think that actually we will see more in the US, especially depending on what happens here in the UK?
It's been fascinating to watch because, these files were released because Donald Trump was under so much pressure from the MAGA base who've been calling for this to happen for a very long time. It feeds into many of the conspiracy theories around QAnon that have, kind of fueled the MAGA movement. And yet, the files were released. Donald Trump did a press conference saying, you see, I'm vindicated. This is no longer a story. Talk about something else now.
I have nothing to hide. I've been exonerated. I have nothing to do with Jeffrey Epstein. They went in hoping that they'd find it and found just the opposite. I've been totally exonerated. In fact,
and it feels like it's gone away in a way that here, we know there are 2 police investigations going on. It almost cost our Prime Minister his job when he'd never even come into contact with Jeffrey Epstein. It is astonishing to see how little is happening legally in America. But that might change. It was very interesting at the State of the Union where Epstein wasn't mentioned at all, but the Democrats had brought in lots of Epstein's victims to be there.
Virginia Giuffre's brother was there watching.
Exactly. So I don't think it's gone away yet.
What moments are there where this could flare up in the US? We've, of course, got the Clintons going to be giving evidence as part of a congressional investigation into Epstein and those who knew him.
I suspect after that, it'll leave the Democrats to call for more people to give evidence. In a way, for them, the awkward bit is getting the Clintons out. Once that's done, it opens up a Pandora's box of who else should be giving evidence and why aren't they, and the pressure sort of mounts.
And what about more pressure to release more files? Because even though we're still getting stories from the last batch as people slowly get through them, at time of recording, the latest thing is photographs of Stephen Hawking photographed with 2 women in bikinis either side of him. So people are still just getting to stories from the first tranche. Yeah. What if we get a few more of these files, which the Attorney General in the US, Pam Bondi, has said will not be released?
We've barely got half So there's a lot more out there. We're being told we're not going to be able to see those files, but the House Oversight Committee have formally subpoenaed the Justice Department to release all documents related to Jeffrey Epstein, and the congressional investigation into Jeffrey Epstein continues. I also think one of the other pinch points, surprisingly, and this is sort of quite awkward in diplomatic circles, but we've always known that one of the ways the UK has been able to influence President Trump has been with the royal family. We held out the great carrot of a state visit. Many people thought, and it was Peter Mandelson who made this decision, that they went too early, and it meant you couldn't necessarily influence him for the rest of his presidency. One of the other carrots, when they realised that, was going to be this great visit the King is making to America. It'll be a huge occasion. You know Donald Trump will want to be all over it. Suddenly, now, the equation changes, because if the King is in America, suddenly it becomes quite awkward for Donald Trump to be photographed with him, because there were inevitable questions about this.
Can we end talking about bowel cancer?
We did do this fascinating episode on bowel cancer, because there is this sort of trend in this country at the moment where bowel cancer affects far more older people than younger people. But while it's going down in older people, they're being diagnosed earlier, treatment is happening, it's going up in younger people. So while the numbers are still comparatively small, the trend is a bit alarming. So research scientists are utterly baffled by this. It's become one of the urgent questions they need to understand in order to understand why it's why cancers in general are growing in younger people, I guess. And we spoke to an absolutely fascinating research scientist who sort of sits in this amazing basement, which is surrounded by huge books of samples going back 100 years of people's bowel tumours, kind of kept in wax. They're almost mummified in wax, and they take little slices of this wax and tumour and they examine them. And as a result, they can see what's changed between now and, say, 1930. Why is it that younger people are more susceptible to bowel cancer now? And the scientists we talked to, there are lots of questions about diet and exercise and what's changed and many of our habits. But he's looking into an E. coli, which is apparently turning up in most of our guts, or there's more of it in our guts than there used to be. And they're finding bits of it in the tumours. So they think this might be a factor that is influencing it. And it might be because we're all being prescribed antibiotics as kids far more. It might be partly diet. That's the really fascinating area of research he's looking at. Anyway, triggered by that, Andrew from Melbourne got in touch and said, I wonder about a possible connection with inflammatory bowel disease. Both Crohn's and ulcerative colitis generally start when young. There's a significant increase in the risk of bowel cancer with both conditions. The incidence of inflammatory bowel disease is on the rise, and while better monitoring has reduced advanced bowel cancer in these conditions, might they have contributed to the rise of bowel cancer in young people? Which is a brilliant question, not one I feel even vaguely qualified to answer, but we decided to ask a man who is. So we went back to Professor Trevor Graham, the director at the Centre for Evolution and Cancer, to find out what he thinks.
Andrea is completely right that the number of people with inflammatory bowel disease has increased dramatically over the past few decades. And it's also completely correct that having inflammatory bowel disease increases the risk of getting bowel cancer, especially earlier in life. So therefore, it's quite possible that some of these increased cases of bowel cancer in young adults that we observe are due to undiagnosed underlying inflammatory bowel disease. However, many of the cases of bowel cancer we see in young adults today arise in people who clearly do not have inflammatory bowel disease. So there's something else going on that's causing this increase. I'd also highlight that the risk of getting bowel cancer if someone has inflammatory bowel disease increases with the severity of the inflammatory bowel disease. And if someone had severe inflammatory bowel disease, they'd almost certainly know about it because it's very unpleasant, and they would have been to see their doctor and be receiving care, and therefore they wouldn't be undiagnosed. And so there's almost certainly something else going on that increases the rate of bowel cancer in young adults over and above this increase in inflammatory bowel disease.
Fascinating. Thanks to Professor Trevor Graham for that. That's it from us. Thank you for joining us. I'm Luke Jones.
I'm Manveen Rana.
And today's producers were Sophie McNulty and Harry Stott. The executive producer was Tim Walklate. And sound design and theme composition was by Maula Setter.
We'll be back, as usual, tomorrow.